review of the training bit. And I do have that one pager that you shared that I can pull up as well.
The infographic?
Yep.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yep, sure. Well, trying to do a quick head count. I think there's a couple more that might roll in, but let's go ahead and get started. And thank you to everybody, because fingers crossed, this might be our last one. And so tonight, I think the goals are just two things. One, wrap up the hiring, training, discipline conversation and any recommendations that come out of that. And then I have pulled out all of the recommendations that we've gathered over the last 5 weeks and kind of put them into an Excel spreadsheet, so it makes it a little bit easier for us to go through. And then we can walk through those. And I think there's a couple of areas that we need to make a couple updates or answer some questions, but use that as a kind of a final sanity checklist. And then I think we're going to be in good shape. I think, the only last thing that we will probably need to discuss is just the best way to present the recommendations to City Council. My thought is, and I'm an outsider, I don't live in Inglewood, but it might be powerful if someone from the community, not someone on the force or associated with the city, could be a participant in that. So I can put the deck together, and in that it's probably pretty straightforward, but it seems more powerful coming from a citizen. That's my thought, but I'd love to hear, what others think, and if we have anybody that might be interested in doing that. And John, I see you got your hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, so alternate policing as well. We didn't wrap up alternate policing last week.
Yeah, I think
alternate response.
Yeah, we'll touch on that. So we've got some stuff that we can review from Cynthia, and then we can see if you have additional additions to those recommendations that we identified.
Thank you.
Yeah. Cheryl, sure.
Thank you, John. I think that makes perfect sense, and I don't want to nominate anyone, but I'd like to make a suggestion if this individual is interested. I think Amy, he's been exceptionally engaged and every step of the way, and by nature and by profession is an exceptional presenter and accustomed to this forum that would be the council and the council meeting. And so I think she approached everything along the way with an unbiased perspective. So in terms of potential citizens that might present to council, if she's interested, Amy, I'm going to volunteer you. Thanks.
I second that, not a nomination.
All right. Well, thank you for that.
I'm happy to do it. I'm also happy to have a co-presenter from the group, just so that it's not just my perspective of one citizen, maybe two citizens. And I want to nominate, I don't see him on yet. For anyone, so Guillermo, I think Gil, Mike, and I, right, are the ones. Donna, right, and I don't know if there's one. I think there's one more.
And then there's Guillermo and Deb, right? Or
right, it should be Donna, Amy, Guillermo, and Mike, correct?
Right.
And Nate as well, but I don't think he's on tonight.
Thank you. Yep. All right. So we can circle back to that at the end, but I think those are really good suggestions, and we can work on recruiting and enticing others as we go on tonight. So let's see here. Let me share a screen. Because I really want to share. So this right here is just the kind of Excel document that I've got, and I threw it into the folder, and I don't even know if I shared it yet. I'll check it in a minute. Let's see. But maybe the best thing to do is, I guess, to jump right into our training discussion, because I think that's where we kind of have the last hole or the last wrap. So Chad, does it help if I pulled that graphic up for you, or do you think you can just want to talk
Well,
initially?
I know it went out to the group, but if we can pull it up just so everybody can take a look at it.
All right, let's see. All right. Can you see that, everyone? All right, I think I got some head nods. So
there you go. The bottom was cut off, but it looks okay now. So just to kind of come back to the whole training discussion, there's been a lot of really good questions, in my opinion, about training and what we focus on as an agency, what we're mandated to do. And we created this infographic to kind of break it down into 3 different areas. And these are areas that we've talked about, but it really gives an idea of how we globally look at training in the police department. And this is reevaluated, the end of each year in preparation for the following year. So, we'll start with the top: peace officers, standards and training. We've talked about this: 12 hours perishable skills, 12 hours of additional skills, which is identified by the individual agency. If we feel we have a void in something, or we have the need for additional training that we haven't had in some time, then we'll throw that into the post standards in our annual in-service. As far as agency training goes, these are identifiable training needs of the organization. A lot of these revolve around recertifications. Arrest control is a recertification every 2 years. Driver instructors do not need to recertify. That's a career certification, but they will go back periodically to brush up on their skills with, we get new vehicles every 4 or 5 years. So obviously there's a different dynamic there. And then we hold in-service days for firearms training for our firearms instructors. And that's an ongoing, evolving process that we do on an annual basis. So those are some voids that we'll fill. And then officer training is individual employee development. This is training identified by officers relative to their assignment, interests, and career paths. And this is really important, because this is where we develop our internal instructors in the organization. Take, for example, a patrol officer that's assigned to a patrol shift. They may focus on DUI enforcement. That's something that they really like to do. And I'm just using this kind of an offshoot example. But there's training to become a DRE instructor, a drug recognition expert, or a standardized field and sobriety testing instructor. So we have a really, really diverse group of in-house trainers, where when we host this annual training for in-service recertification, we don't necessarily need to go outside the organization. We've got internal instructors in just about, not everything that we train on. Sometimes we need to go outside, but as far as recertifications go, that's where our employee development comes from. And these are officers within the organization that can train the rest of the officers. So again, I broke it down into 3 different areas, 3 different sections. I hope this simplifies it somewhat in regard to how we look at training in Inglewood. And, I'm more than happy to answer any questions relative to previous discussions that we've had on this as well.
Thank you for that. I guess, do we have any questions?
I may have missed this, but just to clarify, is this the top, like the green section, the 12 hours perishable skills, 12 hours additional skills, is that synonymous with the onboarding process for a new hire? Or is this mainly ongoing training after somebody has onboarded into the organization?
So that's a good question, Mike. It's actually both. when we bring somebody new on, whether they're a brand new officer out of the academy or they're a lateral officer from a different academy, or I'm sorry, a different agency, we do two things. We put them through a half day of arrest control. And the reason we do that is because, and I mentioned this before, we use Krav Maga in our organization, and they may have come from an organization that utilized FBI or COGA or PPCT or some of these other arrest control and defensive tactics disciplines. So we need to train them up on what we use in Inglewood. Same thing with firearms. We'll have a firearms instructor take them out to the range and qualify with their duty weapon. Each officer is issued a department rifle. We'll have them qualify with that. We'll have them qualify with a taser, the less lethal 40 millimeter. And as far as driving goes, we don't do that during the onboarding process. That's done during our annual in-service training. So it's done during onboarding, and then it's done throughout the year as well. So we're doing this with individual officers, and we're also doing it as part of the post standards as well. So that starts January 1st. It runs through the end of the year. And, post looks at every single agency in the state December 31st, and they're keeping track of every officer. Have they met their 12 hours of perishable skills? Have they met their 12 additional hours of other training? So I guess to answer your question, it's done twice, during the onboarding, with the exception of driving, and then during the year, during our annual in-service training as well.
Gotcha. Thank you. That's helpful. And so the onboarding process into the organization encompasses kind of that first 12 hours of perishable skills. And
Yeah.
is that the entirety of the onboarding process?
Well, as far as training goes, yes, there's a whole, the officers spend about a week. It's an entire week. It's 40 hours going through what we call their administrative week. So they're going throughout the entire city. They're meeting with HR. They're meeting with the chief, with the various commanders in the organization, with, victims assistance, the patrol bureau. They're getting exposed to every single facet of the organization administratively during that first week. And then typically before they're sent out to patrol with a field training officer, that's when they're doing their perishable skills. They're 8 hours. It's actually 8 to 9 hours of firearms training. It's again 4 hours of arrest control and defensive tactics. So that's all done before they're actually put with a field training officer.
Gotcha. Thank you. So the onboarding process is at least a week long.
Yes, it is.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
John Stone.
So I guess I'm just going to go ahead and ask the same questions, because I thought that we were going to get something detailing standardized training in some way, but where does non-gun related, non-arrest control related de-escalation training come into play in this? Where's the schedule of yearly trainings that's agency training as opposed to officer driven training? What does that look like, and what can we expect to see as a standard for all of the police officers in Inglewood?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that's going to come out of the recommendations from the task force. I mean, we talk about de-escalation and what the state mandates. Well, there's a lot that we can do throughout the year through some various training platforms to talk about, bias recognition and de-escalation training. And it doesn't have to be anything extremely lengthy. We can have our officers do, a 2 or 3 hour online course periodically throughout the year, so that we're doing this on an annual basis and not necessarily every 5 years like the state mandates. And we've talked about this before. These are things that are perishable skills, in my opinion, as well. It's important that we all recognize that we have biases in our own cognitive development, and based on our personal experiences. And it's a good reminder once a year to go through that. We went through an ethical training this year as part of our in-service training. That was simply a 2-hour online course through the Virginia Policing Institute. And again, it's just a reminder for all of our officers that these concepts exist. And if we can do that on an annual basis, relative to recommendations made by this task force, then we're going to be better off.
So I guess my question to you is, I know that you're like an extremely well-educated, experienced, and intelligent trainer, and that you've done a good job on ensuring that our police officers are well-trained. When we sat down together and looked through the training, it was very evident that they're getting good training. So I guess my question to you is, what do you think would be beneficial in that realm? What does a standard de-escalation training look like on an annual basis? How many hours does it look like? Do you think that the existing trainings that are out there are sufficient for doing that kind of refreshment on de-escalation and on bias and stuff like that? Do you think that there's one in particular or a certain seminar that's good for them to take or to bounce around between? What do you think would be the right direction for us to go on that?
Coming from the training world the last 4 to 5 years, it's one thing to sit down in front of a computer and click through a PowerPoint and take these impromptu type tests that these classes offer. That's good to a certain degree, but there's nothing more powerful than bringing somebody into a classroom setting, somebody who is educated in this realm. This is what we did back in 2017, is we brought a PhD in who talked to us about community policing, community partnerships, biases and things that we need to recognize throughout the course of our career. That hits more home, in my opinion, and is more powerful and sticks with the officers more so. So we can do this online training through Police One, the Virginia Policing Institute, which are platforms that we use and Post recognizes. But again, you bring somebody into a classroom, you sit 15 officers down and you engage in conversation, you talk about experiences and you talk about diverse backgrounds. That's more powerful than anything else. And that's what I would hope that this task force would recommend.
Awesome. I appreciate that. I think that's a good idea as well, to do, intensive kind of in-service, in-classroom type direct training.
Amy.
So I heard Chad say 2 things, right? One is actually bringing expertise to Inglewood PD, like bringing it in-house, right? So that's this interaction. And the other is that there is experiential learning, right? So it's not just online, right? So there's a person there, but they also engage in learning that is about the experiences together. But I remember also Chief Collins saying there's also value added to when officers go elsewhere, where they're not with just other police officers, right? So I don't know if that's in here, or I think we could be under a broad recommendation of different ways of learning about expert topics, right? So one is bringing expertise in, but also having funding or resources to send officers to specific types of training. I don't know how to phrase that, John. So I'll let you phrase it. I think I remember that from the day one, but I think it's important to not just bring people in, but Chief Collins said very specifically sending police officers out to be with other people who are not police officers.
So am I hearing a recommendation to include external training as part of this?
Yeah, I think bringing trainers in, and then like Amy was saying, sending individual officers out, because I remember that same thing that the chief was talking about, was trying to get officers into trainings where it's not a for police training, it's a generalized kind of class or training that we put a police officer into, so that they're not surrounded by other police officers. And Chief, I see you're here. If you want to kind of clarify that for us, that would be great, because I think the way that you explained it was really good.
Yeah, I think Amy hit it really well. And there were two things I'd like to say is that when police officers go to the typical law enforcement trainings, they're surrounded by other police officers. So there's a certain level of a comfort zone there. And so when you put them into a different social setting, let's say like an ethics class that maybe theoretically it's put on by DU or CU or some other place, and then suddenly he's surrounded by folks with different opinions, and or he or she, and I think that kind of training will hit home a lot more because you're getting a variety of perspectives on different topics such as ethics and bias training and things like that. And so I think law enforcement needs to think outside of the box now, I hate to say, by using that term, but that there are better ways to train, and I think that's one of them. And then secondly, there's no secret about the training that we provide each year, and I think it's imperative that the city manager is informed of changes in policies and the nature of the trainings that we put on during the year. And so there's no harm in doing a quarterly or a semi-annual report to council explaining exactly what kind of training they're receiving. And it doesn't have to be a giant document, but it could show that we're paying attention to what's going on in the world and the things that we're focusing on to do a better job in what we do. And so I'll leave it at that, but Amy and John hit it right on the head. I want to challenge cops with their training and kind of take them out of their comfort zone, because I think history is proving that we need to be even more open-minded to what the community wants and expects. Did I answer the question, I hope?
I think Amy nodded yes. So I'm not quite sure if I've captured that in number 8 here. And if there really was a second one, if somebody could help me out there.
Is it a recommendation to do this, or is it a recommendation to continue doing this? Crickets.
I think it depends on whether or not it's actually occurring right now or not. I think if the recommendation is to ensure that there's external trainers, it probably doesn't matter whether or not it's done currently, but we can add that language in.
John, it's done on an as needed basis right now. It depends on what we're training on. Again, we have a lot of really good internal trainers. But if we are instructing on something that we don't have somebody internally to instruct on, then we'll bring somebody else in. This is also cost savings, because when we have people in the organization that are instructors in various disciplines, then it saves the agency money than sending officers out. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of discussion around bringing people in that can instruct on stuff that we simply cannot instruct on. So it's done on an as needed basis, and that's what we did back in 2017 with the community partnerships and the bias training.
So I guess I'll ask again about this one. So I added the word annually. Does that reflect the desire of this task force to have this external trainer participate in some sort of training annually?
I'm curious, as I see the wording of this recommendation, and based on what I'm hearing from the chief, Chief, does this capture, I think what I'm hearing from you is maybe this desire to actually send officers out into maybe other situations or other forums where they might interact with people even outside of law enforcement, not just the trainers themselves, but also the participants in the training. I think I was hearing that from you, that desire, and I'm not sure if this, as it reads right now, captures that particular aspect of what you were saying.
Yeah, I'm having trouble putting it into words. What I would like to say is, how do you put down that from me and Chad and the training staff to create um, um, a better avenue for outside training? I know that Chad and I will do that. How to put it down in writing, I'm struggling with right at the moment. But I think the challenge for us, and it's one I gladly accept, is to find that outside training that I just mentioned, and then certainly to bring in external trainers. But I don't want to bring them in just to bring them in because we have to. I want to bring them in because they provide value. And so, of course, there's a level of trust there between you folks and us that we would do that. And that's why I think it's incumbent upon us to do that periodic reporting to council to show that we are, making those efforts and actually succeeding. Without the knowledge of what kind of training's out there, it's hard to commit to something and then just do it because now I got to do it because I told these folks that I would. But we will find it, and that's the challenge that we always have, Chad and I. And so I talk too much, but I know we're trying to put this in verbiage, and I'm struggling with doing that.
So would a possible alternative way to capture what your desire is to maybe generalize the recommendation a little bit, but add a specific maybe date or timeline to say create a structure for external training on a regular basis or annually, and report that structure to City Council by X date, whatever you think is a reasonable timeline.
Boom. That's what I was trying to put into words, Mike.
All right, Mike, thanks for that. I'm going to hold on updating that until I get John and Donna in here. So Donna, if you want to jump in.
I don't want to limit it to annually. I like what Chad said, as needed, because you never want to put yourself in a box where we're limited to this annually. What if something pops up and, oh, we've already done an annual training, but what if something else comes up where we need to bring someone else in externally?
All right, thank you. John?
I appreciate that, Donna. I would say at least annually then, though, because right now we're going like years on some of this stuff, and I'd like to see a little bit more frequency and standardization in it. So I think, for me at least, and I'd love to hear if other people agree, beyond the standard, post training, I'd like to see a established recorded policy on a standardized training regimen that the department requires and provides to all officers on an annual basis. And this goes right back to what Chad was talking about with those perishable skills, that we need something that defines what the training is that every officer will get every single year, particularly regarding things like de-escalation, bias training, that kind of stuff, at a minimum. Nothing to prevent them from going above and beyond that if they find an interest in some of this stuff and want to pursue, their own training, or requesting additional training on some of those areas, but having some actual standard, because right now it's basically post, and then as things come up, and then whatever the officers choose to get training on. And we're lucky that our officers choose to get training on really good stuff. But there's no standard, right? We don't have any guarantee that everybody has a baseline beyond post training and beyond doing CPR or something like that when post requires, which is about every 5 years on a lot of this stuff. So my recommendation, and I hope that others will chime in and say whether or not they agree with me, is that we establish a training regimen that is standardized across the board. Something that Chad and I had talked about was, making it like a significant portion, but leaving a significant amount of space for those officers to fill with their own, desired training as well. So having a standard level, a bare minimum baseline that the department sets out, it will be X, Y, Z on these subjects every year at minimum, and then the officers can seek other training and request other training over and above that.
So let me just jump in real quick here, because I want to make sure I want to come back to that. I want to wrap up number 8, and then I want to come back to John's comment here. And I guess as someone that's sitting outside just kind of listening to this, I think that we've got to get a couple more folks that are on this call to share some thoughts and opinions, because right now I feel like we're triangulating on 3 people. And I would be curious what others think. And then I would also suggest that here, this is really tricky. And I think what John is getting at is something that people need to consider in terms of, is the post requirement an adequate baseline, and then we're looking for something else? Or are we seeking to create a post plus, quote unquote, baseline plus kind of this free floating or, variable hours? And I think that if the goal is to do what John has stated, I think you've got to start to define what is quote unquote baseline, and then what your expectations are around additional training above and beyond that. And this issue of external, internal is maybe just a nice consideration or a nice conversation to have at a later date. Not at a later date, but separate from that issue. So with that, Cynthia.
Just since you asked for additional input, I think most organizations have a training plan and the standards that you mentioned, and oftentimes there's the external plan that's dictated by someone else, which obviously Chad already has that information in terms of what's required. And then there's the sort of annual, what we often call an organization as mandatory requirements, that this is what we expect of all people who work for this organization. And then there's the individualized training plan or a learning plan or something like that. So I guess what I would say is that I would hope that if this group has specific individualized or mandatory training plans, for example, that were to be recommended, especially the mandatory for everybody, that might be something to recommend. But I would not feel comfortable getting into the weeds of, the individual dynamics of how the training is delivered or what that individualized plan is that's really specific to the employee. One example I will say is that our organization recently, for example, has a hand washing training that became mandatory related to COVID. Even though we're a healthcare organization, you could make a case that something like that, you need to check the box to make sure that everyone has a good understanding of that. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, or implicit bias, those types of trainings, some organizations are making mandatory. So I would just encourage this group to think about if there is a recommendation of specific mandatory training. CIT was one of the ones we talked about before, that maybe we categorize it in that way, and then my recommendation, because I'm always mindful of when other external organizations are telling us what to do, right? There's so many individual nuances with individual teams and responsibilities within an organization that I feel like that's part of the responsibility of why we have leadership within EPD. So I would just ask the group consider that if there's already a standard baseline, if there's mandatory trainings that the group feels like that they want to recommend, that might be a category. And then to consider leaving the rest to the leadership.
So I just want to chime back in real quick. The only mandatory baseline as of right now is post. Just so that we're all really clear, the only mandatory baseline is post. There are one-off trainings that occur, but they are not a yearly regular standardized schedule unless all of the time that I spent at the police department and in council requests and in conversations was all false.
John, I
I
think
spent a lot of time on this.
John, I think that's exactly what Chad has in this graphic here.
Well, what is it
that's
that he has
exactly
in
what
this
we talked
graphic?
about, and I think that's in our discussion. So I think everyone agrees. If anyone doesn't, now they've got that edification, and hopefully we're clear on that. And so, getting back to what the recommendation is, and Guillermo, I see your hand, so I'm going to pause for you. But we've got to get to a recommendation, and I guess it's got to be. I'm going to get to it here. It's post plus. I mean, post is a requirement. That's mandatory for your department, from my understanding. So it's got to be post. And then the question is does this group want post plus as the mandatory part? And then do you want to define the individual aspects as Cynthia defined? Guillermo.
Yeah, so this is a tough conversation to have. Chad and team, I love the simplicity and the conciseness of the infographic. I think it's awesome. It captures what we need, but I also feel that the world is changing so fast right now. And we've seen in the past 5 months, the more urgent need for different types of training. So I agree with John in specifying, above and beyond what post has, here are the things we need to do. And it should be a post plus, just to, more than anything, protect the department and the officers, and keep them up to speed on the changing and the evolving world that they are working in now. Things like de-escalation, which we talked about earlier, intervention, reporting, and you guys have done such a great job with the department, but I do feel that the world has changed. We need very concrete definitions of what we have here. And it should be, at this point, a post plus whatever, we can deem important. I don't think we're going to get into the actual programs during this call, but it should be a post plus situation.
I'm just going to say one thing, then I'll shut up. I think what John's driving at, and it's what Chad and I discussed following the death of Mr. Floyd. We sat down and we said, we're going to have to emphasize de-escalation, bias training, all of those things that have currently, hit the fan. And so what we will be doing is mandating that training for our officers throughout the year, and probably the next several years. And I think it needs to, so we can do what John's saying and being very specific and having it on paper as to they will receive de-escalation training, anti-bias training and whatnot, because that's what we have to focus on nonetheless. But we also have to be adaptive to, let's say, 5 years from now, there's another major topic that comes up that we also have to mandate. And so I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's what we should be doing, is what Guillermo is saying. And I don't disagree, because those are the things that officers need to be trained in right now. And that's what we need to mandate. And if I've missed the point, I'm sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Chief. I see a lot of hands, and I don't know what order they popped up in because I'm one-handed typing and not doing a very good job. So Joe, Cheryl, and Chad, I guess that's what I see.
The question I had for Chad is, we talked about CIT training, and I see that on the recommendations. Is that post mandated?
No, officers or recruits get some in the academy, but it's not mandated by post once you get hired by an agency.
Okay, well, I think, after hearing what Chief Collins said, I think de-escalation and CIT training for all officers would be great post plus kind of baseline, and then with the option for the police department to add to that over the years as new things become necessary, or if something changes in CIT, you know how these, maybe some new acronym comes up in 5 years. We don't want them to be stuck with an acronym, but the concept of de-escalation and CIT training, as they're defined right now, those could be great. I think that's a great post plus baseline.
Joe, we've been doing that 100% of the officers have to go through that.
All right, Cheryl and then Chad.
Thank you, John. So I am firstly agreeing 100% with what John stated about just expressing the policy for the post plus training, 2 for documenting that very clearly, 3 for socializing that, making it very, very accessible, and making it very, very known and accessible, that this living document exists. And also, I think that the comments that I've been hearing about changes over time, thank you, Guillermo, I think then that we simply add some language, perhaps at the outset of the document, that about the post plus the details being subject to blah, 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 stating that it is a living document. And I also want to finally say that Cynthia's point about perhaps this group not prescribing every single detail about the individual versus group level training components. Yeah, I think we have a few notes here based on what's happened this year around the country. I think those are okay, CIT, de-escalation. But otherwise, yeah, I think the experts, the leadership of the police team have the necessary knowledge to prescribe whatever else goes into the plus part of required training for our officers. I hope that's all clear. Thank you, John.
Yeah, thanks. Chad, and then I think I have an idea to wrap this up, but Chad, please.
Yeah, and I'll make it quick. I just want to comment on one thing that Councilman Stone said. Councilman Stone is correct. Post is the baseline, and that is one thing that we know will happen every single year relative to our training. So he is correct in stating that. I'm biased. We do a really good job of training. I really feel like we do. We go above and beyond, but post is the standard. So if this task force recommends a new standard relative to a lot of these topics that we've discussed, then I think we're moving in the right direction. But I just wanted to clarify that is correct.
All right, thank you. So I guess hearing what I'm hearing and some of the comments that we received, I guess I'm wondering if it might be wiser, kind of as Cynthia said, don't try to do everyone else's job in this recommendation. And just the request from this task force might be that a training policy is created and defined, right? And that it defines what is post-mandated plus what is variable, or however we want to phrase that. And then let the police department, as we've seen so far, go out and do the great job they do of putting that together, conducting the trainings. And then on the back end, you could use what someone suggested earlier, which is the quarterly or annual review with city council on that policy and the adherence to that policy. Any thoughts there? I see a couple of head nods, so.
Well said. Nice summary.
All right, I don't know if I'm going to be able to type it up that fast. Is anyone in this document that actually can type faster than me? I'm going to try to keep going here, but it's just.
I'm in the document, John. I can type. What do you want me to? But you have to get out of that field, I think, before I can type. But if you can tell me, okay, tell me what you want to put in there exactly, because
he doesn't have to get out.
Yeah, so I think this is defined training policy and supporting components.
Okay.
And then I think then that would get. I guess here's the question: does it get presented and then validated kind of annually, or assessed annually by City Council?
I think so. I think
ahead.
so, and I think that it needs to be an annual training regimen because as Chad has said multiple times, we're talking about perishable skills that simply aren't classified perishable by post. And so I think it needs to be an annual training regimen that is annually presented to council for input.
All right, anybody else with kind of a dissenting or complimentary thought? All right, I think we should go with that then. And now what I'd like to do is just maybe run through these from the top and just kind of clean them up and then see if we have any gaps here on the hiring training side of things. So this first one, which was, there was an interest in codifying or making a formal policy of not accepting candidates that have been in trouble with other agencies. Is that still, I assume that's still a desire in terms of a request? And we can just change it to codify or make a formal policy of not accepting. All right, the second one, this was Paul had a comment and he'll probably be joining here in a minute. But I think this one was largely around this second part here, which was suggested moving post requirement back and focusing on known persons that have the right. And I think that this was largely on the recruiting side of things, or the hiring, I guess I should say. And so to me, this was more of a, hey, this is a good thing to do. And it ties in, I believe, with the request for, let me see where there's diversity. Oh, in the next one, number 3.
John, can I just make one comment on that real quick?
Sure.
We talked about hiring and recruiting quite a bit. We held a hiring process today, and I know the conversation kind of went down the road last time of the +2 and do we sponsor people to go to the academy, or do we just take post-certified individuals? Well, we held our process today. It runs today, tomorrow, and and Friday, and we had 9 people show up today. So we had 7 of those people pass the written, and we have 7 going to our integrity interview process tomorrow. So that just goes to show that that's something that hopefully this task force will still consider.
So Chad, can you help me out here? Maybe others are confused too, but so one, I guess I don't know if 9 is good or bad. And then are you suggesting that we continue I guess I'm yeah, help me understand.
No, I don't think we need to continue the conversation. I just wanted to, we talked about hiring several weeks ago and, the potential for numbers that have been very low the last few years. And there were some other programs that the city implemented in years past that they don't do anymore. But, I think today's just a testament to that we had 9 people show up, and, it's not a big candidate pool by any means.
Okay. All right. So, okay. All right.
I have a question real quick, if I may, for Chad. Do you know how many applicants we've had this year off the top of your head, roughly, and like estimated percentage who make it far enough to get into the integrity interview?
So we had 41 that were eligible to test today. By the time the city did their process, we go through and we talked about how there's some disqualifiers right away that we look for. 41 were eligible to test. So 41 were invited, and people don't show up. They don't respond. We had several people over the course of the evening that emailed HR and said they wouldn't be there today. We had 9 people walk into our community room this morning to take that written test. And man, I'll tell you, it's heartbreaking because, we want good people, especially now. And to have 9 people taking our test out of 41 potential candidates is rough. So.
Yeah, that's rough.
So
that's rough.
I'm sorry, you guys, but I'm my job is to be the clock monitor, and so
Yep,
this is all great information. Is there a change to number 2? And so what I'm seeing here is that the suggestion was to not wait for post-certified candidates and to do other activities to increase the pool. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I'm gonna leave that one in there. I'll clean it up later. For number 3 there, from a marketing standpoint, I think we actually have this in here in a few sections here, in a few places. And so it's just is about needing to find ways to reach out to diverse candidates. And then I think we have something very similar in terms of later on in this, in terms of the marketing side of that. Right. And so what I see in this specifically in number 3 is a recommendation to ask candidates if they have suggestions for how to improve the process. All right, so I think then I'm going to leave this one in here. And I think the highlight is just that we're asking to create a new process to get feedback or suggestions from candidates.
I have a clarifying question for you, John. On number 2, is that also including that suggestion that I think had come up about potentially scholarshiping individuals? Is that going to be included in that suggestion?
I didn't see a scholarship thing in here, so and I guess I don't recall that. So if you've got a recommendation around scholarships, then let's get it into this document.
So it was, I remember, I don't remember if we actually made it a recommendation, but I remember having a conversation around potentially putting money towards getting individuals who might come from underserved populations or economically lower circumstances through posts so that they would qualify, so that we're not excluding good candidates based on whether or not they're able to afford the academy. But I might be alone on that.
That was the +2 conversation.
Gotcha.
And no, we had it here. I thought it was the academy costs around $10,000, and a potential recommendation would be that there would be a fellowship for historically underserved community members that would pay for them to go to academy.
Yeah, I remember that too.
We talked about it, but I don't know. Like John, I only made a formal recommendation.
Yeah, it didn't bubble up as a recommendation. Now, if you guys, if that is a recommendation, I guess let's go back through it again and have this conversation again. And I'm gonna just keep on saying this, but I would encourage others besides the 3 that are talking to share your thoughts and opinions as community members and people that live here. Like, I'll say that, Donna, thank you.
I'm for some type of financial aid for people going through the program.
Can I just ask a clarifying question? Is this for potential? If we hired somebody who is not post certified, are we proposing that we would then pay for their post certification? Is that specifically what we're talking about? Okay, that's what I had kind of thought was the recommendation from the first time, but I don't think it's real clear. I think we should do. I think that opens up the pools. If we can pay for their post certification, we massively open up the potential pool, I think.
Without taking up too much of the time here, that process is already it's in place, but it got wiped out by a budget a couple of years ago. I can work with John or whomever to put that together, and we paid for their schooling. We gave them a small wage to get through school, and then we hired them after they graduated, and they went through the process of field training. So the process is there.
Okay. All right, so develop a program to financially support non-post certified candidates in the certification process. All right. Then programs in EPD like the Impact Team that make EPD a strong standout among agencies. We should market this. We have this kind of marketing thing in a few different places. So I'm going to leave it here, but we'll just kind of consolidate all of these hey, let's get out and tell the community all the great stuff that we're doing, because I'm going to guess it's going to fall into one bucket, or at least one kind of person's purview. We just did that one, number 6, right? And this was just a suggestion, but I threw it in here because I want to see if there's anything. So some training on bias and diversity some training on bias and diversity, something where police officers with non-police staff are in uncomfortable situations to learn from the group. I think the end of that is a desire, but doesn't necessarily have to make it into the final recommendation language. Are people in line with this? Guillermo, sorry, I see your hand now.
Just before we walked away or kind of kept going on the marketing standpoint, and I don't know if we need to get into such details in calling this out, but one of the recommendations that I would make would be to create just a different microsite for recruiting on the Inglewood website. Right now it's mixed in with get a police report and traffic violations and all these kind of things. So I would highly recommend creating its own recruitment microsite off of the website.
Others, thoughts?
That's a great idea. The Englewood website's being redesigned as right now. And the flexibility and the ability to support the police department, who maintains pretty much their space. But a lot's going to be cleaned up in this new version of the website, Guillermo, but that's a fine point to
All right, is everyone in agreement with that?
I think we can do a lot
I
more
agree.
with, yeah, and help our recruitment efforts. That's a great point, Guillermo.
John, can I type that for you?
Yeah, I'd love it if you did. Thank you.
Okay.
And I'll just chime in to say, I know the wording in the second half of line 6 is with officers with non-police staff are in uncomfortable situations to learn from the group. I know that might be kind of weird wording in terms of a formal recommendation, but if I remember right, that came straight from the chief. And so I think that should stay in there.
So I guess I know what the intent is, and I guess I'm like, how would you define? So if I asked you to go and assess this, how are you going to define uncomfortable situation? And that's kind of what makes me a little.
Yeah, that's fair. I think what I heard from Chief Collins was getting officers into training scenarios outside of or alongside people who aren't police officers. I think that's an accurate summary of what he was looking for.
So how about can we get rid of this and just say where police officers are with non-police staff?
Yeah, I think that works.
I mean, as somebody that does like a good amount of bias trainings, like I can't guarantee you that I'm going to make you uncomfortable.
Sure, that's fair.
Maybe just non-police students. So it's not limited to just being with Inglewood City staff.
All right. All right. Thank you. Good catch. All right. And then we had the CIT training, and then the only thing we lacked was frequency. And so my assumption is that this is annual, but can someone clarify?
Now, CIT is a one-time 40-hour class.
And so let me ask this question, as it's been brought up a couple of times. Then if I get it once, do I get retrained, recertified?
No, it's a career certification. Now, that said, for example, we had some of our co-responders train this past July. They did an hour and a half, 2-hour classroom portion on a CIT, amongst other things, refresher. So it does get incorporated, but as far as the actual certification goes, it is a one-time 40-hour course.
And all officers are required to have this training?
Yes, Chief Collins has made a point that every officer in this organization will be trained. That includes our dispatchers.
And So I guess what I'm hearing here is just that this is already in place, but that we really just want it incorporated into the policy.
And do you think that those refreshers are something that should happen on a regular basis, Chad?
Well,
Does it change at all?
No, it does, the course doesn't change, and I don't know if Reed can speak more to that, or maybe Cynthia, but I went through it a decade and a half ago. I don't know how different it is now. It's very hands-on. There's a lot of role-playing, scenario-based, reality-based training, which is good, which is what we want. But the reminders from our co-responders relative to our techniques as police officers dealing with diverse populations on the street is a good reminder annually. Yes.
So can I leave number 7 to incorporate this into the policy? Or is there a more specific request here around frequency?
So I think the standard CIT training, that career certification should be a part of standard policy. And as Chad was saying just now, I think some kind of annual refresher, not necessarily putting them through another 40-hour course, but doing some refresher with the co-responders would be my suggestion for it.
So I'm going to put this in here, and I'm going to then just say, that in a couple of years this may change, and so I think that I like the way that number 9 is kind of worded, and we're defining that because it leaves enough flexibility in this for changes. And if it's diversity this year and next year it's CIT or something else, we can catch it through both of those. All right.
Does it maybe just belong in 9?
It does. I mean, it really supports number 9, but that was my question about, is there something more explicit than just having it? Because I'm going to guess that they're going to look at this and say, oh, as it's not post mandated, but boy, we also want to include it in our variable training this year.
So I thought that when we talked about this during the alternative policing, because we know that this is one of the only research-based, evidence-based things that works, I thought, Chad, that you had said that only about 80% of the people had been through the training so far, and I don't know if that's a timing issue. So I guess the only thing that might be worth clarifying is that if all officers are not trained to ensure that this is part of the mandatory training.
Yeah, if I had to guess, it would be roughly around 80, maybe 75, 80%. We had several classes that were canceled this year. There was specifically a dispatcher class that was canceled due to COVID. So there's been no CIT training this year, as far as I know. Maybe you know better, I don't know. But yeah, we're right around 80% probably.
So then I think that if we leave number 7 in there, we address that, right? If it's mandatory for everybody, they'll have to get it as soon as it's available.
Yep.
All right, thank you. Good clarification. All right, and then everything else we've already discussed in this area. Anything else anyone's seeing or not seeing?
John, just some info on number 7. So I am a negotiator for our tactical SWAT team, and our team trains once a month, and then we are part of a regional group that holds quarterly trainings. And so our team, we will get in excess of, like this year, it'll end up probably being 70 hours. But on a normal year with no COVID, we would probably get upwards of 120 hours of this type of training. And Chad's right. I went through the training multiple years ago, and it does not change. The scenarios may change up a little bit, but the curriculum itself is the same. So I mean, we can incorporate it. I agree it doesn't need to be another 40 hours. I think what we did earlier was a couple hours, which I think is a good refresher.
So I guess my thoughts on this is that I think number 9 is really where the meat of this lies. And I think that from what I'm hearing over the last 5 weeks is that you really want to rely on the people that have the expertise to define the policy and the actions, and then use city council as the validation. And so, it's like kind of like to Tracy's point, like it's happening, but I think that the refreshers and the need probably is going to best be determined by the police department. All right, so let's keep going because there is a lot more to cover. Use of force was the next one. And I'm just going to kind of read through these. And if anybody's got thoughts, throw your hand up or just start talking, because I'm probably going to be reading and not looking over at the hands. So this first one was just to have the city attorney review any changes to the use of force policy. We talked about that. And then if significant, refer to city council for review and approval. So that's a little bit different than what we talked about, but I guess now looking at this, it's probably a little smoother to have the city attorney take a look and then present to council. Makes sense? All right. Number 2 was present data on use of force incidents per population using the ethnicity segments, and then to share this with the communities to get their feedback. There's also a request to look at the data from SB 217, right, going forward as a part of that. And then John, I guess, we could take this out, but John, had the recommendation to put this on the website. And I think we have this in a few other areas where we basically said, hey, we've got stuff going on and data that we want to push out to the public. And so, again, it sounds like maybe your web designers are going to be pretty busy here the next coming months. And so that's obviously what this one's about. So I think we can leave that one in as it stands. Moving on to number 3, which was creating the tracking system for the data. And we talked about this last month. I guess that's a typo there, but coming online here, at the end of this month, right?
Yes.
Ooh, I don't know what's going on with the typing here, but let's see. Oh, you guys, it's been comical how poorly I realize I work with just one arm. Okay, so then I don't think that there's anything else there because that system's going to be in place, and the recommendation is just to make sure that it got put in place, I guess, or verify. Have EPD legal team consider removing identification of excited delirium as a quote unquote serious medical condition. And so that's just a request to them to take a look at that. Number 5, ensure the definition. Ensure the definition of excited delirium is accurate. And so that would, I guess, also go back to the legal team.
Those are probably duplicative. There's probably a way just to merge those into one.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Sorry, it sounds like those two to me are duplicative. They could probably be merged into one.
All right. Let me see. All right. Well, we just talked about this. And so the next one was the use in turn regarding use of rubber bullets, 40 millimeter rubber bullets. And the recommendation is that they should be disallowed as crowd control and crowd dispersal tools, and allowed as officer protection or allowed to control individual humans. All right. Next one is, should we roll this into the use of force considerations for council to vote if the police department wants to change the resolution?
I think that was suggesting to roll the kind of First Amendment activities policy into the use of force policy and to make them essentially one document. You're muted, John.
Yeah, sorry. So I guess, does that mean we can get rid of this because it's covered? Going the wrong way. In the other legal request? Right? City attorney will review number 1. City attorney will review changes to use of force policy.
So I think this is actually saying that currently they're considered separate policies, is my understanding. And so it's saying to make the 2 policies into a single unified policy that would fall under number 1.
Which 2 policies? Use of force and?
The First Amendment activities policy.
Oh.
Which is where the rubber bullets fall under.
I can type in that in there, John.
Oh, thank you. All right, thank you. So we'll combine those, and then number 8 then really was about, de-escalation, looking at it, but I think the big piece here was also this educating the constituents so that they understand what de-escalation means. And so it felt like this was more of an education bit, because I think that we're already looking at de-escalation as a part of the overall training package. All right, I see a few head nods, so I think what I'll do is shave. Let's just go see if I can do this.
I'm happy to help you, John, if you want to tell me what to do, but I'm not sure what you're doing otherwise.
No, sorry, John, I keep on forgetting, so I'll try to get you to ask you to do that. Thank you. All right, so if we educate constituents on what they understand and what we're actually talking about, when we talk about de-escalation tactics, right? So this is another kind of marketing piece. And then Chief had this recommendation that we should identify all the de-escalation training needs and focus them on implementing and training. So I guess, to me, let me look here real quick, is, should that one go stay in use of force and just know that it's going to be considered as we look at training, as training is reviewed annually? And I guess I say this more for the time when I'm not here and people are trying to look at this and understand, is that, does it, from, I guess, Chad or Chief, does it make more sense to put this into the actual training recommendations, or it's fine here?
I think it's fine here, personally.
All right, I'm gonna leave it. All right, number 10, verbal de-escalation should be a primary tactic when possible in attempting to non-violently de-escalate a situation. And it just seems like this is another one that just gets incorporated as policy and or training.
Yeah.
All right, and then—
It should be, and it is.
Oh, I'm sorry, say that again?
It speaks for itself. It should be, and it is. So I would leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. All right, and then this one, anything that has a couple stars into it is just one that I think that there was a little confusion, at least on my end, in understanding. So, this one was look at what happens when the community experiences a bad outcome, and then make a plan for what the police department will do to make the community whole once again. And this, I think, this came from Paul, if I remember correctly, just around how we can restore that relationship and kind of repair damage or harm that might have been done within the community. And Guillermo, I see your hand up.
I don't want to lose our train of thought on this one first, John. Mine is related to something else, so we can finish out this one, and then I'll jump in.
Got it. Okay. So I guess on this one, on number 11, my question is more around the recommendation, and it sounds, the recommendation feels like the desire to create some sort of post-incident action plan. It's a terrible way to phrase it, but I can't think of another way to say it. But it sounds
Hey,
like we're
John.
saying, hey, if there is an incident, we want a plan to communicate and support the community coming out of it. And Mike, I see your hands up.
Yeah, as I see this recommendation, I think it aligns a lot with the presentation we heard last week from Ames Stenson around restorative justice, just even in the philosophical approach to this recommendation. And so I wonder if the recommendation here would be to consult with Ames to develop that type of plan and integrate this recommendation into the already established restorative justice consultant that the city of Inglewood has.
If I can jump in real quick, I feel like those are two different things. One is a crisis communication plan that the city should have in case anything happens to go wrong. And I feel like in the past, when you've seen other cities face these sort of challenges, the biggest thing that they get dinged on is the lack of transparency. And it's because they're scrambling to figure everything out. If we had a full-on crisis communication plan in place, who the players are, what the communication channels are, what are the key talking points, then we can address certain things. I feel like restorative justice is kind of a little different than that, but I do feel that the city of Inglewood should have a formalized crisis communication plan.
And does anyone know, does one exist outside of the police department?
Yeah, so there's an emergency manager for the city that covers a communication plan, just the stewards of of duties in the case of different types of emergencies, where communication has to go out to the entire constituency. I don't think that overlaps very much. It should touch on the police, but I know that we did just hire a communication or an emergency manager, and that is her charge, and she's developed a plan, et cetera, et cetera.
So let me ask it this way, and then Amy, I see your hands up. But if let's just say there was a George Floyd situation in Inglewood, would that fall under this person's purview in terms of crisis response?
I kind of don't think so, because no other police specific items fall under her purview.
All right, so then I think Guillermo's hit the nail on the head.
I think he's right.
So we need a specific police department crisis response.
It's such a broad concept because we're not identifying what the event is. Generally, when anything happens with the police department that, like I said before, will hit the media, I'm already on the phone with the city manager and probably with the communications department and preparing a response to the event. And
So
I'm not sure if you can establish a protocol for this, because you might limit what we can do, because you really don't know what the event is. But I understand Guillermo's hit it, but that's the process we follow currently. And again, it depends on, let's say if Chief Collins is gone, will the next chief be different? And it's a communication thing between me, the city manager, and the city attorney, as well as communications. And I think we have that in hand right now. And but to come out with a recommendation for any and all, that it's hard because we don't know what they'll be.
Yeah,
So
and
what
I hear
we
what you're
came up
saying, Chief.
with.
And Amy, I'm sorry, I keep telling you you're
Oh,
going to
sorry, Amy.
chime in here, but I hear what you're saying, Chief, and I guess maybe then to refocus at least on number 11 is that really the request there was around the community kind of restoration, not necessarily crisis action. So Amy, let's get you in here and then we'll figure out how we wrap this one.
Yeah, I think we can, this is my recommendation for wrapping it up. I think it touches on also the education piece, the use of force piece, and the transparency piece, and what Guillermo spoke into. Because I know right now we have Coffee with a Cop, right? Is that under like any specific type of a community engagement plan, right? So I think my recommendation may be a community engagement plan that includes all of these points, right? Plans for when we do crisis response, right? When there has been unrest or disruption in the relationship with community. Talk about use of force, because we talked about that later on, like police, like citizens don't understand what we're doing, why we have to do certain things, right? And then also recruitment and retention, like engagement piece about like what we're doing, what we're needing, why we're hiring, right? So maybe a broader recommendation from a balcony view is community engagement plan that covers these pieces, that really is about our relationship with the citizens, right? That includes number 11, number 8. So that's just a thought to share with the group.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess that makes sense, Guillermo. I kind of want to make sure that we have not totally confused your suggestion, or at least your thought there.
No, I don't think so. I just to respond to the chief real quick, and I know that currently it lives with you, but I do feel that just having something documented in for whatever reason, case of your absence, that everyone would follow the same line of thinking that you would, in the past, and I've done this for brand clients, and their level of conflict is different, but we thought through all of the threats. We would list what are the top 10 threats, and let's run those out, and how would we plan against them. And really the point here is we can't afford to get caught with our pants down.
I agree, and you're spot on with the concept. I think the protocol, or whatever the recommendation would be, is that not only for the police department, but city government, city attorney, city manager should all buy into this concept, because it's just not the police department, it's all the different entities that need to come to be very transparent. And I think that's the way we should do it.
All right, Joe, and then we'll see if we can figure out how to write this last one up.
Well, I hate to throw another wrench in this one, but if I remember right, this one came from Paul Taylor. I don't think he's on tonight, but he had something very specific about kind of a longer, if I remember right, I don't think he was talking about a crisis response. How do you deal with it in the moment? But if our, if one of our, if somebody gets shot and there's a big accusation about it being against policy and potentially criminal from the police department, the goal from what Paul Taylor was saying is, what you don't want to do is do a big investigation and then come to the end and say, nope, he didn't break any laws, no policies were broken, and go on with life. There has to be a better response than that. And so that was not just how do we deal with it in the moment, but how do we deal with healing as a community over the long run when something like that goes wrong. Is anybody else remembering that conversation with me? Because
Yes.
No, you're right, and it's
Yes.
kind of incorporated. It's buried in there where it says, and make a plan for what the police department will do to make the community whole once again. We have to find a way to restore that relationship. I think that's what you're getting at, and that was exactly what Paul was saying. And I'll see if I can pull up the notes from that week. But yeah, that's right on point.
Yeah, that was my recollection as well, and that's what maybe what drew my mind to the restorative justice piece, because I think that aligns more with what you're saying, Joe. Guillermo, I think you have a great point in types of like the crisis response and what community engagement looks like there as well. I think that's a great point. I was just remembering Paul's comments, speaking to a little bit of a different situation.
And that still goes to Guillermo's comment. When you have a crisis response, it's not a response that just in a moment, it's over a period of time. I mean, that's where you legitimize yourself as being transparent. And so I think that crisis response could take weeks or months or whatever. And that's how you heal the community, by being open and honest with them.
All right. So I guess, am I hearing then, is there a need for an additional recommendation here that addresses I see Guillermo shaking his head no, but that addresses like the police department crisis response specifically? We've got the community side, and then do we need to talk about, is there a desire to have some recommendation or something around a formal program, I think as Guillermo or someone said, for the police department to follow in a crisis?
I like Amy's suggestion of having the umbrella of a community engagement plan and kind of the subheadings of maybe the crisis response, as well as the plan for restoration in whatever relationships are ruptured in the community, whether that's on an individual level between one person and one officer, or whether that's between a group of people and the police department as a whole. I think all those things are interconnected, as this discussion is demonstrating, so I think it makes sense to include both of them under one community engagement plan.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that? All right, so I'll go in and I'll clean that one up later, but we'll add that community engagement plan in there. All right, and now we start, and I think, let me just scroll down because this was a big one. Yeah, all right. So this is the alternate policing discussions. The first one that came out was refer this section to attorneys to simplify. Oh, I should have cut the other piece. Anyway, sorry. Refer this section to attorneys to simplify with a request to change quote unquote reasonable to feasible, and also clarify the points that differentiate between warning shots versus any type of shots. And I didn't, go ahead.
Yeah, that should have been in the use of force policy, I believe.
Yeah, John,
it actually came up here, but I just didn't include the minutes or the preceding comment. So let me see if I can open it up. I mean, we can move it into use of force if that's oh, here it is. Let's see if I've got it in this other format. All right.
I pretty distinctly remember talking about it.
Okay. So does it still apply? I guess I'm not going to worry about what section it is right now. Does it still apply?
I personally think it does. I don't know if others do.
All right, Mike, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as I was reading this document, it looks like the first several here, the first several lines in my reading of it fit more under the use of force. I think I made a note. I think it was the first 6 or 7.
Yeah, maybe I messed up with my copying and pasting here. Let me take
that and reformat it later, and that's fine if we do. But even the fleeing subjects, line 6, yeah, even through line 7 seem to relate more to use of force, and then starting in line 8 with John's recommendations around crisis intervention training and co-responder program, it seems to me that's where the alternate policing recommendations start.
All right, I'll go and check that out and clean it up. So let's just assume we're still talking about use of force then. It seems like this still applies as a request. And then here was a possible recommendation. So Paul had noted his desire to see an integration of training, right? So reality-based training. I think this is where he was saying, it's not just weapons training, it's also de-escalations while you have a weapon, in use or potentially, I guess. And so I guess what we need here is just is this a desired recommendation from the task force to integrate this type of training? And then we would move this up to the training section. Chad, sorry, didn't see your hand raised.
That's okay. I just want to clarify one thing with regarding to reasonable versus feasible. Are we talking about a specific use of force policy?
That was in reference to lethal force.
As far as warning somebody first?
Warning. Yeah. Warning when feasible as opposed to reasonable.
Okay. Yeah, and I just want to say that's a question for the attorneys, because all use of force is based on objective reasonableness, and that is from the Supreme Court ruling down through House Bill 217. So we just need to be careful on that, and that just needs to go through, I think, a legal recommendation. So that's all.
And that's where you're talking about number 1 there, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I think that's, yeah, so we've got this. Refer this section to attorneys?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. All right, so number 2, anything on this one from Paul? If not, we'll strike it. And Paul had hoped to be on by now. Yeah, he's not on, so. All right, we'll strike that one. The next one is change the wording to say under, quote unquote, under no circumstances shall City of Inglewood officers discharge a warning shot. I think we went over that one pretty well. We wanted to codify the chief's policy of investigating all use of force complaints. I'm going to apologize because it looks like I just copied and pasted these in the wrong spot, as Mike pointed out. Shots fired from a moving vehicle are rarely effective and should be avoided in almost all cases. I think that the recommendation is to put that into the training. Would it be appropriate, Chief or Chad, as a policy, or is it just more of a training activity?
Well, you can't say it. We don't recommend, and it is rarely effective. That's correct. But you can't limit the officer, because never say never. There could be an opportunity where it is objectively reasonable. So it can't be taken out of there completely.
All right. Hey, Joe, can you do me a favor and just at the end of that one, just type, incorporate into training?
I think that was in response to the language in the code of use of force. And so I think
Yes.
that was specific. It wasn't training, it was the wording. I think our group just helped tweak it a little bit.
All right.
That's my recollection as well.
All right. So, Joe, I guess then we can just add, update use of force training materials. Yeah.
Does that capture it?
Yep, that works for me. All right, thank you. Number 6 here, revise the EPD policy regarding fleeing subjects, which aligns with SB 217. All right. Have EPD begin tracking and collating these pursuits. And then here's a possible recommendation. John talked about a desire to expand the CIT work, expand the co-responder program, and expand the pilot program to do 911 diversion. And I think that we've got this kind of pretty well covered in a couple bullets coming up, because I think this is largely what Cynthia did an amazing job of presenting to us a few weeks ago, high level. So I guess maybe hold on number 8 until we review the rest and see if we have a gap. All right, so number 9 was another one. So modify the co-responder job description to include case management. All right, we're also going to add proactive outreach based on access to CIT referrals with the new RMS. And do we understand enough about that to take action? Like proactive outreach, do we need to define? Should we define what that is, what that looks like? Or Cynthia, is there something that is, I don't know, standard
We
outreach?
talked about, yeah, I think it's pretty standard. It's usually at the discretion of the officers. If they complete a CIT referral, then they're identifying who we need to proactively outreach. These are usually either frequent callers to the 911 system or individuals who are high utilizers. That could be due to substance use, it could be due to mental health, or it could be due to homelessness. And so that was pretty, it was really a wraparound idea. So I don't know that proactive outreach needs to be defined to whom, but I don't think it would be a far stretch to say that it would be those particular groups.
Can you clarify by whom are we just saying officers who receive the CIT training do proactive outreach?
I think it's the co-responders.
Yes, sorry, this is, that's a good point. So the recommendation should probably be modified, add proactive outreach by co-responders based on access to CIT referrals through the new RMS. Does that help clarify?
Yeah, I think we can combine 10 and 11. So modify co-responder job description to include case management and proactive outreach. It can just be one.
Sure.
Amy, can you say that again, or can somebody incorporate that? Sorry.
I'll go into it.
Thank you. And Mike, did you have a thought while we're updating?
Yeah, I had recommended too, just based on the kind of the expanded job description of the co-responder team, which I love. I'm fully in support of that recommendation. I was going to recommend that we consider rebranding the co-responder title as well. I think that was a conversation during the alternate policing, because Cynthia had presented 3 categories of alternate policing: the outreach, the 911 diversion, and the co-response. And we have a team of co-responders. And I think what we're recommending, we're building off that foundation to expand into those other categories. And so I don't know if it makes sense to have a brand or a title that just refers to one of those categories if we're expanding into those other categories, which again, I think is great. But I just think make sure the title keeps up and encompasses everything that those folks are doing.
I agree. And to follow up with that, I'm wondering, Cynthia, if you can maybe speak to this. Right now, we've got you guys at 80 hours. In expanding to these wraparound services and follow-ups, would it require additional hours from your team to be able to fully provide those services?
Yeah, thanks for asking. It's a good point. And to Mike's point, it's 80 hours of co-responders who are in that embedded program out in the field, not necessarily those on line 43, item number 16, retain or expand 8 hours a week of care navigation. That's really more of the expansion of the outreach.
And you think 8 hours is the right number for that?
I think it's a low number.
Okay.
I would defer to Reed or Chad for input on how much time they think could be devoted, or what we could do is we could evaluate over time. You know, if you think about especially with the new system, it's largely dependent on officers putting in a CIT referral and helping to identify who needs that proactive outreach. So I don't have enough information to be able to say exactly how much that would be, but that would be a really good question for Chad or Reed.
Thank you.
And Cynthia, correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember right from your presentation, some of that proactive outreach and I think maybe case management specifically amongst the co-responders was the idea was for them to kind of work on those tasks, maybe like in between calls and some of the downtime. That was part of the recommendation, correct? So it
We
would
did
be
talk about that in regard to the co-responders job description, but we've also talked about being able to add more proactive outreach. So you can incorporate it into the job description and they will be able to do more. I've actually already met with the team and they're very on board with that. But I think the issue for consideration with this group in particular is, are you actually recommending that there's, for example, a dedicated case manager who only does that proactive outreach? And then the co-responders can also do some of that supplemental, because you need a co-responder to be available at all times to respond in the moment during the hours that they're working. And so that would be something to really consider. You can only do so much with the existing staff that you have before you have to add more people.
Yeah, gotcha.
I think that this goes to the point that you were making, Mike, that we do have these two co-responders, but we are asking for additional things from them. Maybe it's not necessarily rebranding the existing co-responders, but bringing on additional aid from the group that provides us with co-responders to have that case management and proactive outreach, and having them be, case management and outreach specialists as opposed to co-responders, so that we do have those co-responders readily available to respond to calls, which is, kind of what we want them for anyways, right?
Yeah, I like that. And I like that. I like that it builds off the foundation that these folks have already been working on in developing the co-responder program.
Absolutely.
I think that's the cleanest way to get to where we want to go.
Yeah,
So,
same.
John and Mike, I'm going to ask you guys to define what the recommendation is here for us.
I mean, I'm going to go for broke. I think we add a full position. I think we make a recommendation to add 40 hours of case management and community outreach and follow-up from a case manager / community engagement specialist. I don't know what the title is. I'll leave the titles to Cynthia on that one. I'm sure there's some kind of name for this person in the industry.
Yeah, and we can flex that, especially when you think about that community engagement plan, what would make most sense for the community. But I think what you're really talking about is on number 16, retain or expand care navigation / case management. They're all kind of the same thing. And if you're recommending to expand that from 8 to 40, then you would get a lot of effort out of that additional staff.
That's the number I like. I'll be quiet now.
I'd support you. I think this is a great idea, and whether it's, I'd be interested to hear from Reed and see what is 40. Is that something worth going for right now? Should we start with 20? Recommend 20. I mean, I'm open to 40 if we have the funding for it. Do we think we could immediately fill all that time, or? I mean, what do you think, Reed and Cynthia? Is that something that we should jump right into or build up to?
Sure. I think we could use quite a few hours. I'm not sure if we could fill 40 at this point, but certainly like a 32 hours. But kind of 40 isn't too far off of that. In terms of paying for it, that's above my pay grade. That kind of falls to the chief and the council to determine where do we get the funding for it, because it's not in the 2021 budget. So it is in the RFP for an option in the future, an RFP that we're putting out, so that we will have a number on how much will that actually cost. And the number should be somewhere for a full-time person in the $40,000 to $50,000 range.
Yeah, I think we should make this recommendation. And I think if this is something we can use in the community, I think it'll benefit us. And council can definitely make an appropriation and modify the budget to fill this. I think we should at least make the recommendation and see how the rest of council feels about it, if you guys are all supportive of it.
I would support that as well. So if that's the case, I don't think the language as it is in line 16 represents what John said originally. We want to, right? We want to specifically appropriate or request a new position or add a new FTE to the police department, that's specifically for XYZ and at the rate, 40 hours a week, right? I think if it's not explicitly stated here, we're 3, but we'll still have problems convincing the rest of council.
Yeah, and I think it's I think it's a 40-hour okay.
Minimum.
Yeah, 40 hours minimum from the co-responders group so it's not a co-responder, right? It's from, I'm sorry, Cynthia, I'm having a hard day. What's the name of your organization again? I apologize.
Okay, we're All Health Network.
All
And
Health,
what I'm
geez.
trying to say is that it's the co-responders who are usually clinicians. They're for
Right.
real time, and then it's also a case manager, which is not usually a master's level. It's not a licensed person, and that's for the proactive, a little bit more for the proactive and the CIT referral and the outreach.
So yeah, retaining 40 hours of that from All Health is what I'm interested in. And I think Member Anderson and Wink also were supporting.
So I just want to be clear that what I heard Reed say was that he would have a hard time filling 40 hours and that 32 was what he said. But if you guys want to put 40 in, I'll put 40 in. But I just want to make sure that we understood what Reed said. At least I understood.
We'll take it though if that's what council appropriates. We'll figure something out.
Yeah, I bet you will.
Could you update
I'm unclear.
or John, could you refresh the page, please?
Yeah, I got no refreshing to do. If it needs a refresh, it's on your end. I just need to hit enter while I was typing after I was done. So
I just typed it in the language is all, but okay.
I'm sorry. Is there a change? I'm sorry, Cheryl. I'm not quite getting that.
I think it's
Yeah,
there.
I typed it in already. So if you refreshed, you would see what I typed instead of redoing it, but it's okay either way.
I was typing it too, so I think John's one out.
Either way, what I see there is 40 hours. Is that the desire?
Yeah, I'll
Got it.
I'll voice up and get behind 40 hours. I think that's a great recommendation.
And I just asked
Cynthia, can you
change
can you clarify?
retain.
Hold on. Let's let Cynthia go and then we'll catch up.
Yeah, and I think I know where Amy's going. Right now, 16 reads retain or expand 40 hours. Since you're putting 40 hours in the recommendation, I would take out the word retain. And so just to specify that it's expand care navigation, case management to 40 hours a week. Amy, were you going to ask about the CBO contracting out with somebody else?
No, I was asking about the different job responsibilities because I feel like they're smushed together and I'm unclear what the recommendation is.
Smushed together in terms of care navigation / case management.
Right. So I think in number 10, we wrote that a co-responder right now is going to expand to do case management and proactive outreach. Mm-hmm. But then we're also saying, are we hiring someone just doing case management and outreach?
Yes. Yes.
So we're saying the co-responder can do all these 3 tasks and we'll have additional 40 hours just to do case management.
Yes.
Is that what we're saying? Okay. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. And in regard to 17, one of the things that I had recommended based on some of the things we talked about was whether or not it would make sense to, because that was one of the, this focus on homelessness is one piece of the puzzle. And so the issue came up, would Englewood want to work with an organization like All Health, where we do primarily mental health and substance use, and then try and rope in another organization to help supplement with work for people who are homeless, because they do have specialty services. I will tell you that since we've had that discussion, I have attempted, and Reed has also attempted, to try and outreach other organizations that provide homelessness services, service providers for homelessness. We're not getting a lot of traction for that. And so one idea is that All Health could provide that general case management. We do work with people who are homeless all the time. Usually there are other comorbidities that are attached to that. And so it may be worth considering eliminating number 17 and just leave it as expand care navigation case management to 40 hours a week, with the understanding that that would include not just a specialty subpopulation, but all populations.
I support that idea.
And Cynthia, will we need to specify in, I guess what would be number 17, that it's this kind of holistic as you defined, or is that almost implied by the titles we're using?
I think for our group, everybody on this task force has a good understanding of who we're talking about, but if it's necessary to specify, because again, with line 16, it's expand case management to a new FTE at 40 hours a week to provide outreach to individuals, and this is where you could put the categorization, because we're usually talking about mental health, substance use, and homelessness.
Sorry, so to provide outreach to, can you say that again?
To individuals with mental health, substance use, and homeless needs. Something to that effect.
All right, I can get in and clean that up in a second. All right, so I guess if we update 16, and that means we get rid of 17, right? Oh, Guillermo, sorry.
Yeah, I just had a question that was confused. We're talking about expanding the services, but when we presented these services, we also talked about there being an RFP out as well. Has that RFP been awarded yet?
No, it has not been awarded yet. It should be coming out probably next week. It just is up for bid. That's all. So, and the RFP covers all the options that this group is looking at.
Perfect.
So we don't know which organizations will respond, or do you feel you have, is it only going to be All Health Network, Reed?
We know for certain All Health will respond. They're very interested in continuing our relationship with them. We have a very positive working relationship with them.
Right.
And, we obviously have to look at any incoming bids, but
right.
we
Okay.
will certainly look close at that.
Good. Great.
And ultimately, the bid has to go in front of council for approval as well. So you will see the end result of it in front of council for approval.
Great. Thanks, Reed.
All right, moving on here. And I'm going to apologize. It looks like we're going to go a couple minutes over, but I think that's going to be better than tacking on another week. So the next one was enhance the connection and the use of SAFI. No disagreements there. Ensure the quantitative and qualitative review and evaluation of the co-responder. I think that should probably say program. And I guess who would be responsible for this? Is this a police department or is it someone else?
Oftentimes those are things that are included in an RFP. And at that point, it would be determined who would do that. For us, we have a quality improvement team, and so they do a lot of the external evaluations.
Oh, I guess my question is who within the city of Inglewood would own this? That's, I guess, where I'm going is I want to make sure that it's a police thing. I guess that's really what I'm asking. Police, city council, some other agency? Data person? I don't know.
I think the police department owns it because we manage the program.
All right, and does that make sense to everybody else? That's the right agency to do that?
usually someone outside who are not involved would do an evaluation, so not a police officer and not all health in this case. So that way they will ensure neutrality. But we don't need to go with that. Usually that's just what happens when they're.
Yeah,
And
we
then
would just
it's
all
a-
making sure it happens. We wouldn't do the evaluation ourselves.
Yeah, and then it's a budgeting issue.
All right, then I think what I'm hearing is I'm going to leave it where it is, the way it is. Okay, so here's a couple that we had, and this was from Cynthia. I don't know why I keep calling you Cindy. Sorry, Cynthia.
I'll call you Johnny.
If we're going to be wrong, we'll be really wrong. We had put this, and this was, if you remember, this was on the final page, the recommendations, and this was kind of at the bottom, where we said a couple of things. And one was future, how to intervene in 911 level, right, in the diversion. And I'm just going to remind everybody that we spent a good hour and a half. Cynthia and Reed gave us some really good data, and we've got the YouTube video out there. So like, if you ever need future clarification on that conversation, which was really good and in depth, I think that's a great resource. And so the reason I think we pushed this out to future, Cynthia, remind me, but it was more around budget and almost capacity, right? Is that this was felt like it was a future action and something that wouldn't be able to be addressed in the near term.
It's a feasibility issue in terms of there would need to be a contract negotiated with, in particular, the Colorado Crisis Hotline. And there's a state work group that has been looking at pilots for the 911 diversion, and it just recently sunk because they didn't have the resources to start up the pilot. So I was concerned about the reality, like you'd be making a recommendation that I didn't know if it could actually be implemented, which I felt like might put the police department in a bind to say, okay, we're going to recommend that this happens. And in reality, it may be very difficult to implement. I do, however, I think we all are on the same page that this is absolutely something that we do want to do. It's just a matter of how do you make a recommendation knowing that it's not a super swift, easy thing to implement, and that it could be, it could be quite some time before this infrastructure is set up.
So I'm going to leave this up to you folks to discuss about if and how. Joe.
Yeah, I think the tension I'm feeling, and because I appreciate what you're saying, Cynthia, around it, like just the feasibility, the immediate feasibility of the 911 diversion. And so I appreciate kind of the note of realism in the recommendation. And as it reads right now, it seems like the fact that there's asterisks and future is just a cause to put it aside and not really think about it. And so I wonder if there's a way to find a middle ground between both of those to make sure that it's a real recommendation that this group gives, while also recognizing that it may not be year one or month one, year one, maybe year 2, year 5 that it's up and running. But is there a way to assess feasibility or kind of start the trajectory towards something like it? I guess that's a question for the group.
Well, if you remove the word future, you would have exactly what you're asking. Determine how to intervene at 911 level to divert mental health calls to the crisis system. So to me, that sounds like what we're all on the same, what I think we're all on the same page about. And so the word future is my being a pragmatist, but it easily could be removed.
And we can address that issue even if there isn't formal funding for that by simply educating our dispatchers with certain callers that are very low risk to giving the caller a number to call. So this is a really broad thing. We've been looking at this long before the task force came into being, and before some of these other issues came up. So it's on our radar too.
All right, and Joe.
Wasn't part of our discussion with, I don't know if I understand what exactly SAFI is, but wasn't part of that being able to refer 911 calls to a SAFI response? Do they do that, or do they not do diversion? Okay.
No, you have to go through only the Colorado Crisis Hotline can dispatch SAFI. The enhanced connection use of SAFI is that law enforcement actually has an expedited response through SAFI. They get prioritized. So if an officer calls the Colorado Crisis Hotline, the Colorado Crisis Hotline is supposed to get SAFI out there. SAFI has a 60-minute response time, and so that's too long. So really what you want is to be able to divert those calls to the crisis system so that then the crisis system can dispatch SAFI without law enforcement ever being involved in that system. Does that help explain, Joe?
Yeah, that helps. And I think I like taking if we take future out of that, we can put this to council and we can do more research, if we need to hire a contractor to help us figure out how to move this along faster, anything we can do to expedite it from the city council level. If we have this in the recommendations, that gives us the go ahead to explore that. Thank you, Cynthia.
All right. I think we're good then if we strike that as it is for number 20. And then so the next one, number 21, was John had recommended that the city secure grants for emergency and or short-term residential detox and addiction services. And I guess this is just a discussion of whether or not we want to formalize this recommendation.
I really like the recommendation. My question is it a recommendation for the police department or is it a recommendation for the city of Inglewood?
I think it's probably for the city of Inglewood.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on this?
For the city council members, if you do decide to pursue this outside of law enforcement, I would really like to be able to participate in that discussion with you all, if possible.
And maybe it does need to come from this task force, but it's not necessarily a recommendation for the police department. It's a recommendation from this task force to support the police department and to work, with All Health in conjunction on that.
Yeah, or we take a similar approach that we did in the housing conversation around we recommend to the police that the police force try to leverage the city. Like we recommend that the police force recommend to the city that this would be good.
I like that too.
So I guess I would love some more input from somebody so we can close this one out, whether,
For both 21 and 22, I think those are both conversations city council should have. Maybe they should go under a different heading, recommendations for solutions that would impact the police department or something like that, because these really aren't recommendations that have much of anything to do with police other than it makes their life easier if these are in place. So I think it's appropriate that we have these recommendations, but they don't really apply directly to alternative policing or anything like that, but maybe under a new heading. But I would support both of those two recommendations under that category.
Yeah. I think it relates to the police department in that it equips the police department to do the type of policing that they want to do. It allows them to have somewhere to take somebody who needs detox right at hand, and actually kind of provide that service rather than kind of continue to just sit in the tension, So that's why I think it'd be good to maybe have a recommendation from the police department that these types of services more readily available would be helpful.
I guess, and let me ask this question then, because Mike has brought this up a couple of times. Is that needed? Is it needed to suggest that the city or that the police department pushes that to city council? It's just a couple words, but I just want to know how you guys want it phrased. Does that change the impact or the potential effectiveness of this request? That's really what I'm getting at.
I mean, honestly, Sorry, these recommendations are recommendations to council regarding policing in Inglewood, ultimately, you know? So I don't know if it matters one way or the other, the way that we word it. I think that it's good to recommend it to the city. And we've got the chief and Chad and, you know, Reed here, and they've heard us talk about it, and I've not heard any of them disagree with these ideas. So I think that it's safe to assume that they're supportive of them at this point and would also be supportive of that in front of council if we were to ask them for their input on it there as well.
Anybody that disagrees with that? I think it's easy. All right, so we're going to leave it in this other section, you know, impacting the police department. And then we're just on this last one here, which is another possible recommendation. Could there be a non-officer response, right, such as mediation? And so for certain non-criminal offenses, and this probably is very closely related to all of our other diversion conversations. And so I guess that's the question here. The recommendation, it looks like, would be a request for a non-officer response.
With the mediation program, we are already able to do that. It just happened today, possibly for the first time, but it involves a couple of neighbors in a dispute for years, and we were able to say there is no reason for an officer to go here. We have this program available to do this. And there may be some other aspects that other people have in mind here, but that's one thing that we have in place and that we're using.
I really like that we're already using that. I think that's going to be an awesome program. My big concern is that it's a pretty significant delay between the call and the response on that. And what I personally would like to see, and I know I've said this a few times, and I'm going to keep going back to it. 40% of the police service calls are non-crime, non-violent related. And it doesn't seem like a good use of police officers' time. And based on the conversations that I've had with the police department, they agree that it's not a good use of police officers' time to send them to, you know, wellness check calls, to send them to calls that have no evidence, no reason to believe that there's any crime being committed or that there's any violence occurring. And so I think that this maybe even ties back into the co-responders, back into all health, and having an alternate response that does not involve a police officer going to do some of this 40% of calls that really doesn't require a police officer, which would further free up our police officers to do the job that they've already got. I don't know how many of you guys have gone on a ride along, but it's intense. It is just one thing after another. It doesn't stop. And so, you know, giving these officers, you know, time to do some of that community work that we'd like for them to be able to do, to actually engage with their community a little bit, and to be members of the community, not just enforcing laws upon the community. I think in order for them to be able to really settle into that role, it's necessary to lighten the load on them a little bit. And I can't see any better place to do that than in the 40% of calls that don't require a police officer.
So thanks, John. So I think if I remember back to this conversation, we talked about this a good little bit, was that it was actually in the second sentence where Steve noted that, and I think Leticia said it as well, is residents call 911, they expect an officer to show up. And that's what this question or this potential recommendation was generated from, was, is there a way to do that with still meeting the expectations of the residents? And
so I disagree. I don't think that every time someone calls 911, they expect an officer to show up. I think when people call 911, they expect help to show up. I've called 911 for medical emergencies. And there was absolutely no reason for a police officer to show up during a medical emergency that only required EMS. And so what I'm suggesting is that there isn't always a need for, because we don't have a separate line for medical emergency.
John, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I get what you're saying. I guess I'd love to hear what the other folks that presented data to us last week or whenever we talked about this, so that we can get to it.
Sure.
So really, Chief,
let's do that.
On your team, I think that's who we need to hear from on this issue. Is it possible to do this?
Well, it is possible. It's done in many cities.
John, let's let these folks answer. I appreciate your
Totally fine with other folks answering, but I want it to be couched in a way that's actually accurate to the situation.
Okay.
Yes, and again, this is something that Reed and I have talked about. But there's more to massage. Dispatch has to be able to massage these calls. If somebody calls up about, and I'll try to be succinct, a friend of mine is suicidal. I think in that case you have to send a cop because you haven't you don't know anything about the suicidal person. But there are going to be some of those, like John Stone has mentioned, that I think we have to start integrating responses by the co-responders to respond to certain calls that normally a police officer would do. And I think that's going to require some training and whatnot, but it can certainly be done. And this is, like I said, Reed and I have talked about it, and it's something that we have to do because it's obvious that we need to provide the appropriate service to the community when they call for it, and it's not always a police officer. So yes, I mean that's something that we spoke about and we will be doing.
In those situations where the dispatcher is very confident that the person calling isn't necessarily in need of an officer, is that something that a co-responder could then respond on their own so it wouldn't be the co-response, it would just be the response from the clinician? Is that what you're referring to, Chief?
Yes.
Okay.
I think everything that we're talking about are those 911 diversion. And so whether it's 911 diversion to a case manager, to a clinician, to a mediator, to SAFI, I mean, all of those to me fall under the same umbrella of how can we work to improve the disposition of what happens when someone calls 911 to make sure that the right person arrives on scene.
So I guess for me, I think I know what it is, but what's the recommendation or the request here? Because is it to continue the program or is it to change the way the program operates? And Joe, you can have your hand up, so I'll let you jump in here. But
Yeah,
I think that getting
I kind of hearing what the chief's saying and Tish and Councilmember Stone. I feel like what we're after here, and I think we all agree that we need some way to respond to 911 calls that aren't those. I don't know if you can always tell on the front end whether this is one where we leave the call and we go, we didn't really need a police officer there. But maybe you can't always tell on the front end. On the back end, you learn a little something. And maybe as we train dispatch and get a little better at it, get some of these 911 diversion measures in place. I think we have those things in the recommendation. And with determine how to intervene at a 911 level to divert mental health calls to the crisis system. Isn't that what we're talking about? I'm not sure if there's any additional recommendation that needs to be made under this heading.
Is the crisis system the 1 hour response or our own responders?
Right now, it would be designed as the 1 hour response with SAFI, but that is all something that I feel like that the city could have input on of what do you want it to be? Because you have to have a contract in order for the calls to divert and go to SAFI, which means you could probably also have a contract. There's training protocols for 911, for dispatchers. There are a lot of different ways that you can work that 911 system based on the needs of the city.
So maybe the recommendation is that we ensure that the contract with SAFI is not a 1 hour response, but is actually an emergency response or a direct response.
Unfortunately, SAFI SAFI is contracted with the Colorado Crisis Hotline. And so what you're really talking about is how the 911 call gets diverted to the Colorado Crisis Hotline, because SAFI can only be dispatched by them.
Gotcha.
I
So what
wonder,
if we, just one last thing real quick here, what if we had somebody from All Health whose job it was to be paired up with like a emergency medical responder to respond to these non-criminal calls as a co-responder to medical services as opposed to a co-responder to law enforcement?
Right. And whether it's All Health or another contractor, all of those things are possible. That really is about how the RFP is written in terms of what the city wants and needs for response. But yes, that is possible.
yeah, I wonder if the recommendation is to do exactly what Chief and Reed have already alluded to, them they're moving in the direction of, which is to use the staff that we already have, the co-responder staff, and pilot a program in which that staff would be the response itself, not a co-response. And start, and it seems like we're already moving in that direction. I think that the recommendation might be to continue in that direction and pilot that as soon as possible.
And I think
Amy,
we're going to
please.
do that to some extent. And I just want to caution you that our current co-responders and systems probably are going to be apprehensive to go on many of these calls in a solo capacity, that generally it's a two-person response in these more crisis calls until they've been. So Colorado Crisis Services spends a period of time on the phone really seriously evaluating these. So that's the only, overlying concern, is that we can't just send one of our therapists out by themselves on many of these calls, that they would need somebody different. And John alluded to, the emergency services provider. That happens in several cities. Denver's talking about stopping their paramedics with that. We have talked about it. Would a case manager work? But of course, all these things are very expensive, and we are very sensitive to that in these economic times of how can we do this the best way without, burdening the city.
Yeah, that's totally fair, and I fully trust you, Reed, and you, Chief, to figure out the scenario that puts the responder in, doesn't put the responder in danger in any capacity, for sure.
Thanks, Amy.
I was trying to type it in to make it clear. I think there's two different things, right? We really like our co-responder program, and we're pushing to even expand it, period, right? But I think John Stone is asking, is there a non-officer response alternative that's not necessarily Cahoots or STARS, because they'll have like ambulances and nurse, and Cynthia said they don't need to go out every time, and it's really expensive, right? So I don't know if we have the answer today, because that program may not exist that fits our city's need. But I think the recommendation could be, can we ask the police department to develop a best practice or protocol for when we should conduct non-officer responses to 911 calls that are non-criminal calls. I need to rephrase that, but basically we need to think about, the police officers need to figure out what is a good idea of when generally we can do non-officer responses. That's a really tough question to ask. I read all the qualitative data. Like, a lot of people there's so much uncertainty in the 911 call to make that assumption. So we need to dive deeper to know even when to go on these non-officer response calls. So I think for them to look into it further is the recommendation at this point, or it could be a recommendation, because we don't have enough information, but we do know that we want this, right? So for the sake of time today, I don't know we can dive deeper for more specific than that.
Yeah, Amy, I agree with you, and I don't even know, even if we had more time, I don't know that, to your point, like you said, this is a multi-week effort. It's not a couple of hours, and so I'm going to try to step back and tell you what I'm hearing from this conversation is that there's a desire or a wish to reduce the number of non-officer or the number of officer response calls. That's plain and simple. That's it. Reduce the number of calls that officers have to respond to. Now, then the recommendation could be to go and figure out how to do that. And then that's all the work that Amy talked about. But high level, I guess I'm just hearing you guys say that you want to reduce the number of calls officers have to go out on. Is that fair? So can we make a recommendation? And Joe, can you help me type this up? But just the recommendation is just to investigate or to investigate ways to reduce the number of calls officers have to respond to. Right, and then you have all the other program options, that we've talked about, as well as additional programs you could look at. But it seems as though, at least from as a spectator, you've got a lot of programs and a lot of options, especially with these RFPs coming up, that might be able to help. And then I guess that would allow us to get rid of what is now in 23. So I think we've covered that off. Well, yeah, and that's it. So I guess with this, I'm going to probably try to clean this up. I'll probably realistically get to it tomorrow afternoon, maybe. But I think everybody should have access to this document right now. And I think next steps would be me cleaning it up. Everyone at your leisure, if you want to take another last look at this thing and add some comments, if you want, if there's some things. But otherwise, the next steps would be to get with Amy and hopefully a few other people from the community that are willing to present this and kind of represent this work to City Council, and then figure out when and how we do that. And I'll work with Chief and Sean at the city office to figure out how and when we would do that. Does that make sense?
Do we have a timeline for when we want to make sure we get this task force gives feedback to when you're ready, John?
Yeah, so City Council's initial, even before I kind of came on board, was actually, I think they were hoping to get recommendations either last week or this week. Yeah, so we were a week behind, and then we got another week delayed. So we'd be 2 weeks off roughly. So they're looking for a pretty quick turnaround on this. So, in my mind, if we can wrap this up in the next 2 days, at least this list of recommendations, then we're able probably to turn around and say to City Council, we could talk next week or the following week, depending on availability.
And if I'm not mistaken, our city manager's on the call. I think I see him in the participant list. Sean, if you are here. Maybe
he's here. He's just keeping quiet.
And just, I don't remember when it's lined up to be on our council agenda.
Yeah, at least when I talked to Sean earlier today, it's not on the agenda. And so we needed to finish this work. And then I was going to get with him and try to figure out when we could get on the agenda. So I guess I would say, let's not worry about when we get on the agenda. I guess just know that we want to do it in the next 2 weeks. The biggest thing is just saying, yeah, we're good with these recommendations as a committee. And then I'll work on pulling together kind of the final materials to make these presentations, or this presentation. And Sean, yeah, he's not a panelist, so he can't speak. So I don't know, Ryan, if you're here and you can open it up for Sean to speak. Otherwise, Sean, I guess you can text me.
I'm sorry, what is it? What did you need?
Can you promote Ryan from a panelist to, a participant to a panelist, or you know what I mean?
Sure, yeah, hang on just a sec.
I would suggest that we go through this list one more time tonight. Just kidding.
We could just leave the call open.
Hi, thanks everybody. Unfortunately, I don't have that schedule in front of me, so I'll have to get back to you on that.
Has it been set, Sean?
No, it hasn't,
Okay.
but we would have to look for the next available opening. And I assume that this would come to council as a study session before we actually brought policies. So we can do that as soon as possible. I think we've got some openings, but I don't have that list in front of me right now.
All right, well, thanks. So I think our first piece of work is kind of finalizing this, and then I guess I'll make this last request. So Amy was volunteered and graciously agreed to participate in presenting this data. I guess, is there anybody else specifically kind of from the citizen group that would be willing to co-present with Amy?
I was going to nominate Mike. Mike, are you good with doing that? You're used to going in front of council.
Actually, I don't think I've ever been in front of council in this capacity. So yeah, I'm happy to help.
I was going to say you're about to be.
I'm happy to have Mike, but I just want to double check, like in the committee formation, Mike is listed under stakeholder.
Yeah.
I'm totally fine with the stakeholder speaking, but I just wanted to clarify that with the group is okay with that.
That's a great point, Amy. And I'm willing to readjust if the group.
Yeah, and I don't know that I'm the best person to answer this. It might be Sean or somebody else. I think this is more of a political and a community thing. Like, who's it best going to be received coming from?
I think you're right, John, that it would be really helpful or efficient that it come from citizens and no sort of party with vested interest either way. And just my view, but I really liked that suggestion of yours.
So I guess, Mike, does that leave you in or out?
Mike is a citizen as well. I mean, I think everybody's got a stake in the community in some way, but
Yeah,
I'm
but
happy with Mike, but if somebody else wants to as well, that's, yeah.
Yeah, and I'll say this, like, I mean, I don't know your council, but I can't imagine that it hurts to have 4 citizens or 3 or whatever from the community up there kind of co-presenting either. I think it just shows that there's greater unity.
Yeah, I'd be glad to as well, guys.
Awesome.
I think Nate is speaking, but I can't hear him.
Oh. Good eye. You gonna sign for us?
I think he says he's in to present. I'm just,
Okay,
yes.
got it. This is good translation work. All right, so I think we've got our 4 then, right? Mike, Guillermo, Nate, and Amy. So I will work with those 4 to kind of figure out how and when, and Sean, obviously, we get on the study agenda. And then we'll make sure that everybody gets copied on kind of what the final is, and you get the updates on when it's going to happen and all that good stuff as well. All right. Okay. Well, I appreciate everyone sticking around. I know this was an extra week and then another extra half an hour beyond what we planned, but I think this is really good work. I think that there's a really solid list of recommendations. And as somebody that lives up in Lafayette, I would be more intrigued to move to Inglewood after participating with you guys in this than I ever knew before. So for me, it's been really enlightening just to understand what's going on. So personally, I really appreciate kind of the input and the work that you guys have put in over these past 5-6 weeks. So a big thanks for that. And if you got any questions, shoot me a note, and otherwise just kind of look for a couple update emails on the documents in the shared drive.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, John. Appreciate you guys. You have a good night.